Hello everyone, welcome to yet another episode of Azure On Air. Today we have an interesting guest, Steef-Jan, who's a technical integration architect at HSO, and he's one of the senior cloud editors as well. So, giving a moment to Steef-Jan to introduce himself. Hi Steve.
Monitoring the process end to end has never got that much thought, and then it's going to be pretty hard to assess, okay, where in my process am I experiencing issues. Once you're identify what kind of integrations you need, what the components are, then you really have to look into, okay, how I'm going to support this solution once it becomes live. You buy it from the market, right? So you do serverless 360. That's more like a buy versus build decision. How you're going to set that all up, but it could still be that in that kind of situation where you move from BizTalk to the cloud, those people saying, hey, why did you change the contract and why didn't you notify us? So it's also kind of, it redefines in a way that you also start to learn more and more about your system. Hi, I'm Rita. Thank you for inviting me for this podcast session. Like you said, I'm Steef-Jan. I'm working in this industry for over 20 years, predominantly integrations. I'm currently working at HSO in Vedenau, which is a company, an ISV, doing a lot of Dynamics 365 work, including integrating with the Dynamics 365. It's a company that's close by, so I can ride my bike to the office. Besides that, I'm an Azure MVP for over 10 years, doing a lot of stuff in the community. I'm a writer of serverless nodes. I write for InfoQ, that's a worldwide website translated in multiple languages for all kinds of technology, including cloud technology, programming languages, architecture, and so forth. And I'm predominantly doing work for the what's called the cloud queue. So I write stories around Google, AWS, and Azure. So that's what I do. Yeah.
Super, super to hear that, Steve. So, may I know how long you've been with Azure?
I've been with Azure from the beginning. So I was built in 208, where
Hmm.
Ray Ozzie, I think what's his name. So he was the successor of Bill Gates, revealed the cloud platform Azure. So it was revealed in 208, and I think 2 years later it became more or less a GA. And then initially you could do some VM stuff. And I think one of the early services or platform services was the service bus. You might familiar with the queuing tag.
Yeah.
So I've been using Azure for since then, but it was like pet projects, some experimentation before it really took off in 204, 205, when I really did some um, hybrid integration work, and then slowly doing integration work itself with the tooling that's available, like logic apps, functions, and etc. So I've been there for a while.
That's nice to hear, Steve. So, as you said, you were dealing with Azure integration, and you are right. So, what is the major needs that an organization should have for an Azure integration? That is, implementation and building is all fine. Post the build, what is the major need that an organization should have
Major
for an
need
Azure?
is the monitoring. That's also the topic of this talk, of course.
Hmm.
Is once the integration solution is at play, you need some kind of monitoring in place as well, and the support for it. So these integrations usually support very important business processes. So this could be the order process, this could be invoicing, logistically, process, etc. And instead of having them on-prem, being with an intermediate like a BizTalk server supporting those processes, you have now more distributed type of solution in the cloud, leveraging logic apps, functions, let's say database customers, the caching, all that kind of stuff. So it's more distributed. Um, that also needs some type of monitoring, and sometimes this hasn't been thought through enough, or they just leverage some of the um, services like Azure Monitor, Application Insight. But holistically, um, monitoring the process end to end has never got that much thought, and then it's going to be pretty hard to assess, okay, where in my process am I experiencing issues? Are they being signaled, or at least identified quickly enough, or how can I identify them if I don't have the information? So that's kind of the challenges. So those are one of the things that usually come into play or become more apparent once the solution is live. Then it's like, oh, okay, what do we do now?
Mm. Yeah. So I also have a question right now here. So at which point in time you feel the organization should implement a monitoring tool in their system?
I think from the get-go. So
Mm.
once you're identify what kind of integrations you need, what the components are, then you really have to look into, okay, how I'm going to support this solution once it becomes live. So you need
Mm.
to set up some requirements. What are the needs? How do you want to set up the end-to-end monitoring? How are we going to facilitate in a process like a process model where you identify what your integration flows are, what your first, second, and third tier support should look like, who's responsible for what part of supporting that solution, what skill set is needed, and also what kind of products are we going to use, like tooling. So in the end, it's like people, process, and products. And that's what it really deals about, and that should be identified from the beginning. And you set up some documentation as well. I call this or knowledge base, right?
Mm.
Which has this how the solution in the end is implemented. More of the time details like what kind of connections do we have, what are the security details, who's gonna support what kind of environments do we have, etc., etc. So that's one part.
Yeah.
Setting up that knowledge base, identify some of the issues that potentially could occur, like networking issues and such, and how should you mitigate it. So, like setting up something like a first aid kit,
Mm.
identify what kind of products you in the end want to do. So you can set up kind of a requirements matrix and then look at, okay, what does Azure provide for us, or what kind of custom solution could we build, or what kind of tools could we get from the market that are available to support our integrations.
Mm. So as you rightly said that people should use it right from the first go. So currently we see many people being migrating from BizTalk to Azure, right? From on-prem solution to
That's
Azure.
true. Yes.
Yeah. So in that case, how will the monitoring platform or monitoring part of the migration work for them? So like when they move from an on-prem to an cloud, will the on-prem solution also need monitoring such just like the cloud solution has?
It should. Usually, the on-prem solutions like a BizTalk could
Mm.
have monitoring in place, like a BizTalk 360, right? It's a pretty
Mm.
well-known product that has been used by many organizations. So that's a pretty obvious one that can still remain in place, but can
Mm.
be uh, coincide or work with tools like Atomic Scope, or if you're going to move or migrate your solution completely, because that's also
Mm.
possible. Like you lift and shift, although that's not kind of a viable option because you use a lot of VMs and it's quite complicated and hard to do.
Yeah.
So you either migrate piece by piece, so having some of the stuff still on-prem and then some in Azure, or you could even lift and shift everything by just doing replatforming and redesign and re-implementation in the cloud. And then you have to look at other products like Serverless 360.
Mm.
I think no doubt that there's some solutions out there, or you can think about, okay, I'm going to try to stick as much as possible to the Azure platform using Azure Monitor Application Insight. So there's a lot of stuff you can do yourself,
Mm.
but it requires a lot of effort as well. Or you buy it from the market, right? So you do a
Mm.
Surface 360. That's more like a buy versus build decision. How you're going to set that all up, but it could still be that in that kind of situation where you move from BizTalk to the cloud. Yeah, there's many ways of doing it. You could do it by a big bang, just go over easily, do it step
Mm.
by step. It depends a little bit on the strategy, but you could end up with a myriad of tools. But then again, tools are important
Yeah.
to get that insight into your integrations and your processes. It's important. You need to know what goes wrong where, so you can quickly identify what the problem is and resolve it. Because
Mm.
time is money in the essence, and yeah, your processes in the end need to be available and healthy for 24/7 usually.
Mm. Yeah, that's really a good thing to implement a tool which has an easy configuration part as well, right? Because
Hmm.
you never know whom to be involved in that part. You will have to invest on skill resources as well for implementation, rather than you can use a tool which is very easy to configure and put in place with your support team itself. Yeah. So I would also have a question with you, like you are a consultant as well, right? So
True.
yeah, so you might have seen people who are coming up to you asking for monitoring solutions or for suggestions, right? So how do you deal with them? What are the challenges that you faced? What are the challenges they faced in their solutions coming to you for a monitoring tool?
Well, tool or process, or like, okay, Steef-Jan, we have set up this solution, we've gone live. Okay, how are we going to support the process overall? So one is be, okay, you need to have your people in place with the right skill sets, of course, so that manage that
Mm,
people and process. But to help them in their day-to-day job, they also need tooling. They need to know, okay, where can I look? Can I use Azure Monitor by going into the Azure portal and that kind of stuff? The challenges here, though, are like, okay, but I've never touched the Azure portal and I'm not too
mm,
familiar with the Azure portal. Okay, then we can alternatively look to products or tooling that might be more catered for what you're used to, or what might be more user friendly, or has an experience like, okay, I can work with this type of tool because it makes my life easier and it's also easier to use.
mm,
um, and then I kind of suggest, okay, we can have a look at, let's say, a Service 360 product that is easier, does give you quite a fast insight in how healthy your integrations are and such.
mm.
So next to your, your people and process, you're looking at products as well for making them lives easier.
Yeah.
So that's how I approach it. Like, okay, Azure can be challenging also if you don't have enough knowledge.
Mm,
Sometimes maybe it's also not smart to have people touch the Azure portal depending on how much access right they have. Usually, like, okay, we'll just make you owner and do your thing. But giving someone owner rights in the subscription might not be too smart, because
mm,
things can break or things can happen. So if you want to um, isolate them from the Azure environments, then
mm,
having a different tool in place to give them the accessibility, but also the way of allowing them to manage in a good way, in a safe way.
mm,
That can be an option as well. So those are kind of the considerations as well. Thinking about your monitoring product in this case for your integrations. Okay, how can they help? How can it be an intuitive user interface? How can it be that they, or at least give them a tool that they can really do their job, and where they also don't have to fear about breaking things in Azure itself?
mm.
That can help as well. So those are
Yeah.
time of the things that I consider or talk about when we're looking at monitoring a live integration solution, or integration solution that is going to go live in a couple of weeks or months.
Mm. Yeah. So, also, Steve, I have a question. Like, people who come to you with a complex integration solution, right? Complex Azure integration or
Hmm.
environment. So, at which point do they feel it is tough to monitor the solution? There might be resources which are hard for them to monitor through Azure and all that, right? So, at which, with a complex integration in hand, which point they come to you as a consultant?
As it becomes a pretty distributed solution with many components that are in Azure to support the process end to end. So connectivity with, let's say, Dynamics 365, then it goes through certain steps like
Mm,
um, mapping it to an intermediate, and then the intermediate is mapped to different types of messages that need to be routed to different target systems. Then it becomes quite complicated and challenging.
mm,
And then what you kind of need to do is either set something up like a business activity monitoring that can help in end to end, or another type of solution where you would aggregate all these stages where the message goes through, or your information that goes from A to B or from B to A,
mm,
have that centrally set up, and then having some kind of portal around it that could be type of custom solution, or you would leverage something that tools have, allowing you to do this end-to-end processing. Because in the end, the complexity comes from the fact that it has to go through all these steps, right?
yeah.
From source all the way up to target, or multiple targets. And then it becomes challenging because it's like, okay, but the message comes from this system, the
mm,
source, and then it has to traverse all the way up to these target systems. And then, for a support person, it becomes really like challenging. Ooh, looks pretty complex. So it's very important to have a knowledge base around the complete setup
mm,
of the integration, even if when it becomes complex. So that's something I always tell them. And the other thing is like, okay, what are the points? What are the stages of your integration that you need to monitor, and how can we um, correlate them? Because the correlation becomes pretty complex as well if it's an integration that has to go through all these steps and all these components in Azure. With BizTalk, you had this black box, right? You had your adapters, it comes in and comes out. So it was a big
yeah,
black box, but something went in and something came out. But it's not a
mm,
big black box anymore. It's a distributed set of components that are supporting your integration in Azure, and that makes it pretty much complex. If it's just one message that has to go to another message, like a more point to point, then it's pretty simple. But it's not that simple. It's usually uh, with Dynamics, you integrate with multiple target systems, and information comes back. So it's like a
mm.
logistic process, it's your purchase order process, your sales order process, and those are quite pretty complex processes, which are reflected by pretty complex integrations in the cloud.
Mm-mm. Yeah. So I also have this question that monitoring and security are something that are interlinked in some way or the other, right? So
True.
yeah. So how do you throw a light on that? How do you explain that interlink to us?
Security in the end is the accessibility towards your source and target systems. With Azure, that kind of involves Azure AD, and then you're talking about app registrations, you managed identities, and all kind of stuff. So that's one end.
Mm,
The security also comes into play for your staff that needs to operate and um, monitor all those solutions, because they need some type of authorization as well,
mm,
but also need to be aware of what are the security details of your solutions. An example, for instance, from real life is that an app registration has a expiry date, right? So if your app registration set up to have a trust, for instance, with D65, um, something with regards to business events, and if that app registration expires,
mm,
then your solution might fall over, or it doesn't work anymore because it's expired. And sometimes it's hard to identify, okay, hey, what happened?
mm.
So that's where
Yeah.
security and monitoring are, kind of intertwined or related to each other, or
Mm,
who has access to what. That's another thing. So security and monitoring definitely have something in common,
mm.
and both should be taken very seriously from the start.
Of course.
The
Yeah.
security with also with other target systems, right? There's always maybe there's a rotating key solution that the keys are being refreshed every now and then. The certificates, for instance, is an interesting one because certificates also have an expiry date.
Mm,
So those are the things that are things that you need to monitor as well. And so people that are supporting integration solutions and monitoring them, they also should be aware of all the security details, because there's so much stuff going on, and there's connectivity with all kinds of systems, usually supported through app registrations, or maybe certificates, and so forth.
um, we have this final question for the podcast here, that is
Yeah.
how do monitoring refine the system? So we have an Azure existing system, right? So placing monitoring there, how does it refine that existing system completely?
And that's actually a very good question. So the kind of the short answer is the observability. So
Mm,
redefine means if you have your monitoring in place, you do it properly, you have like all kinds of, let's say, eyes and ears
mm,
inside your solution, means that you can then easily
mm,
spot where your issues occur. So
yeah.
you can know, okay, it happens right there at this process. What's very important with your integration solution as well, I like to point this out, is that you, for each kind of flow you have from your system to, let's say, an intermediate and then to a target system, or a flow itself, that you do tagging. tagging like, okay, this is order O1, as in an order comes from, let's say, Dynamics, that or needs to go to Dynamics from a target system. It's mapped to some kind of intermediate and then goes into Dynamics, which is then would be like order O2. So
mm,
tagging is very important, knowing exactly where what happens, which type of flow or part of a flow
mm,
um, might have an issue. So that's what the redefine is about. It's also about tagging, identifying what kind of flows you have and how to monitor those. Because if you know, okay, ord one has an issue, then okay, I know exactly where in my complex integration landscape, because you have all kinds of flows from left to right, etc. It's like, okay, this is where the error occurs. And then also provide some context to that issue.
mm.
Look, provides you with the insight, okay, so this doesn't really work
Yeah.
because um, some data is missing. There might be a more technical issue regarding connectivity. There might be a security issue because somehow security details have changed, and someone hasn't made you aware of it. Validation issues, for instance, that someone has changed the contract. They're saying,
Mm,
okay, well, we changed the contract at our end, at a target system, and a target system, or at least people that are monitoring this target system and maintaining it, don't provide you those details.
mm,
So then you have this validation issue. Oh, well, okay, we're now missing a field apparently, and then by quickly identifying it, you can talk to those people saying, hey, why did you change the contract and why didn't you
mm,
notify us? So it's also kind of, it redefines in a way that you also start to learn more and more about your system,
mm,
which is also a part of your observability. At least that term kind of provides that, this term of observability. It kind of tells you how your system behaves and works. And
yeah.
having that knowledge, having a knowledge base, having a set of tooling, having an appropriate process all in place with regard to monitoring means
Mm,
that you're better in a better shape of monitoring it. And that kind of part is something that's definitely an afterthought.
mm,
Security, what you just mentioned, not so sure. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But monitoring is definitely something like, at least I noticed it in some of the projects, like, oh, yeah, we'll monitor, we'll do it later on. We're not going to
mm,
bother about it now. But it should be like, no, you should be bothered by it right away, because you know this too, right? It's about a complete life cycle of a solution is about, let's say, 20% of implementation, and 80% complete lifetime all the way up the end. So it's
mm,
80% of that integration solution resides in operations. Someone has to maintain those. If it takes, let's say, 2 or 3 months to build something, it might be that the integration itself has its duration or its lifespan of a couple of years.
yeah. Yeah.
And that's
Rightly
something
said.
that
Yeah.
should be something that should be in the minds of customers as well. Sometimes they say, yeah, we understand, but yeah, we or they have, might not they understand, but they don't have budget for it. Usually, it's a
Mm,
budget question as well. It's like, okay, or let's do it later on, the afterthought thing, and then it's like, okay, and how do we set it up, and what kind of skill set do we need, and then a lot of things need to be taken into consideration. Like, okay, how are we going to do this? Are we going to monitor it ourselves, or are we going to have some other party in place with managed services?
mm,
However, they also need to have a good setup, or at least some plug-in, like, okay, how are we going to monitor this solution? So a handover is important as well, including what I call the knowledge base. So everything that's being built, and including like, okay, what are potential issues? What are the security details, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah. Yes, you rightly said that many customers feel that monitoring is something not right now that which is needed, and also they push it in terms of budgeting problems as well. So that should be avoided because you have to invest in something to reap something, right? So that's something to be noted here.
Definitely, the monitoring requires definitely a good thought,
Mm,
but also good investment. Having an appropriate budget set up is either the setup and like building up the knowledge base stuff, so you could do a handover to a managed services party in the end of the day too, because you cannot do a handover of your solution without
yeah.
any details about how the solution was built, what potential errors can be, what the volumes are, what the formats are, what kind of the agreements are with your target
Mm.
systems, etc., etc. So yeah,
Yeah. So that was super explanation from your end, Steve. So one final thing, what would be a quick advice to our listeners in terms of Azure usage, as well as how should the beginners of Azure take this particular podcast? In which perspective should they take it?
What they should take away from it is once they start implementing an integration solution, also think about, okay, how is it going to be operated afterwards? Like, you take some time to build it, but it's multiplied by a magnitude with regards to uh, it being monitored and and it has to be kept healthy.
Mm,
So think about that too. So think about the requirements, think about some of the security details, think about setting up a knowledge base, thinking about, you know, how does the ops guy have to look at this, or the people that are supporting this? What do you feel when you're building this they should know about your integration solution?
mm, yeah.
Also, how are you going to monitor this integration solution? What kind of components are you use? What do you think, the requirements should be? Uh, Talk or reflect to some other people in your organization or your colleagues you're building your integrations with when you start learning. Do some consult an architect as well, thinking about this complete, monitoring ops or observability, how you may want to call it. How do you want to instrument it in the end, and what kind of tooling do you want to
Mm,
use? So it's the takeaway is people, process, products.
yeah. So all the three P's should be noted here.
Yeah, think about the three P's
Yeah. Final
with
final
regards to
takeaway
your.
is the three P's that we have for you in this show to all our listeners.
Yes, exactly.
That was an amazing session, Steve. So you gave
Thank
an
you.
highlight about how important a monitoring solution is and what is the role of it playing in a complete complex integration solution as well. So it was a pleasure hosting you in our show. Thank you for
Thank you.
coming.
Yes,
Thank
thank you for inviting me, and hope this will be useful and helpful for our listeners of the podcast. So, thank you.
Cove.co